You're watching a Highwire Media podcast. All right, so you just heard on the news that a celebrity took a plea deal. And you're thinking to yourself, well, what exactly is this plea deal or plea bargain? Don't worry. In this video, I'm going to tell you exactly what a plea bargain is and the different kinds of plea bargains that people can agree to when they're charged with a criminal case coming up. Welcome to the True Crime Never Sleeps show. I'm your host, as always, Larry Lace, and we are bringing back our Let's Talk series as well as our Shit Out of Luck series, which will air on the last Friday of each month. And this week, we're talking all things plea bargain. So what is a plea bargain? Plea bargain is essentially an agreement between the defendant and the prosecutor. In exchange for the defendant pleading guilty to a crime, the prosecutor usually offers the defendant some kind of reduction based on their guilty plea. Now, before we get into the specifics of why this happens or the benefits on both sides, let's talk about why this procedure is controversial. A lot of people dislike this procedure. The number one reason why plea bargains are controversial is that while I mentioned the two sides of a plea bargain, the defendant and the prosecutor, there's one side that's often left out: the victim of the crime. Generally speaking, prosecutors do talk to victims to understand their wishes. However, a plea bargain is ultimately an agreement between the prosecutor and the defendant. That means the victim's wishes are not always carried out in the plea bargain process. Another reason why this procedure is controversial is that the defendant, the person accused of the crime, has a say in what their consequences will be. Many people feel that someone who committed a crime shouldn't have any input into what their punishment will be. Despite controversies, plea bargains are incredibly common. In fact, the vast majority of cases in criminal court are resolved via plea agreements. It's almost like Oprah handing out deals. You get a plea deal. You get a plea deal. Everybody gets a plea deal. But why is this? Benefit to the state or the prosecutor is that they avoid the risk of losing the case. If the jury or judge find the defendant not guilty, the case is over and the defendant will not face any consequences. And that's a significant risk for the state. For the defendant, the benefit is avoiding the full range of possible sentencing. Let's say the crime carries a sentencing range of 1 to 3 years. That's a relatively small range, but other crimes might have much larger ranges: 6 to 30 years or even 6 to 60 years. Some sentencing ranges can even go up to 100 years. When facing such uncertainty, defendants might agree to a plea bargain to avoid the risk of receiving a maximum sentence. By doing so, they can secure a sentence on the lower end of the range. For both sides, plea bargains provide some level of certainty and resolution. Now let's talk about the difference between a fully negotiated plea and a partially negotiated plea. The key distinction is whether there's anything left for the judge to decide. So example 1 would be their fully negotiated plea. Let's say the defendant is charged with residential burglary in, a state like Illinois. This crime carries a sentencing range of 4 to 15 years. In a fully negotiated plea, the defendant agrees to plead guilty and the state agrees to a sentence of 6 years in the Department of Corrections. In this scenario, there's nothing left for the judge to decide. The defendant knows exactly what their sentence will be: 6 years, and avoids the possibility of receiving a higher sentence like 10 or 15 years. In our second example, partially negotiated plea, in a partially negotiated plea, there's still something left to be determined. Using the same example of residential burglary, the state might agree to cap the defendant's sentence at 8 years. If the defendant pleads guilty, they'd still go to a full sentencing hearing. At the hearing, the judge could sentence them to anywhere from 4 to 8 years. However, the defendant would no longer face the risk of receiving a sentence above 8 years. So while the sentencing range is narrowed, some uncertainty remains in a partially negotiated plea agreement. Now let's talk about the different types of plea deals that can happen. Starting off, you have the reduction in sentence. In exchange for pleading guilty, the defendant might receive a sentence on the lower end of the sentencing range. For example, if residential burglary carries a range of 4 to 15 years, a plea deal might result in a sentence of 6 years. This is especially common for defendants with prior criminal histories, as it allows them to avoid a higher sentence. And then, number 2, you have a reduction in charge. Another type of plea agreement involves reducing the charge itself. For example, a defendant charged with residential burglary, a Class 1 felony, might agree to plead guilty to burglary, a Class 2 felony. This is significant because Class 1 felonies have harsher sentencing ranges, 4 to 15 years, while Class 2 felonies carry a lighter range of 3 to 7 years. By reducing the charge, the defendant minimizes the risk of a longer sentence. Then, number 3, avoidance of collateral consequences. In some cases, the plea agreement doesn't involve reducing the charge, but rather avoid certain collateral consequences. For example, someone charged with domestic battery cannot receive court supervision and must have a conviction on the record if found guilty. However, they might plead guilty to a different charge like battery, which is still a Class A misdemeanor, but does not carry the same consequences. Another example is a sex crime like criminal sexual abuse. The defendant might plead guilty to a similar crime, such as unlawful restraint, which doesn't require registration as a sex offender. This type of plea focuses on avoiding the additional consequences associated with certain convictions. And then you have alternative programs. Finally, some plea agreements involve alternative programs, such as diversion or probation programs. These programs are typically available to first-time offenders and provide a second chance. The goal of these programs is rehabilitation. It might include drug treatment, mental health treatment, community service, or education programs like earning a GED. Restitution is owed to a victim. That might also be part of the agreement. The biggest benefit of completing these programs is that the defendant avoids a felony conviction or criminal record. For many defendants, these alternative resolutions are the best outcome possible. So why don't some people get a plea deal? You might wonder, how come everyone gets a plea deal except me? Well, there are a few reasons why the state might not offer a plea deal. So, to begin with, the state wants a harsher sentence. The prosecutor is seeking a sentence on the harsher end of the spectrum. They may not offer a plea deal. Their goal in such cases is to impose the maximum penalty. Number two, you just got overwhelming evidence. The evidence against the defendant is very strong. The state might not feel the need to negotiate. For example, there's video evidence of a defendant driving on a suspended license. The state can easily prove its case without needing to offer a plea deal. So, what are your options without a plea deal? If you don't receive a plea deal, there are two main options. One, you can take the case to trial. Two, you can enter a blind plea. Blind plea means pleading guilty without knowing what sentence the judge will impose. The judge will decide the sentence after a full sentencing hearing. Now you know all about plea agreements, what they are, the different types, and why some people don't get them, whether it's a fully negotiated plea, partially negotiated plea, or in an alternative program. Plea deals are a common way to resolve criminal cases. If you have questions or suggestions for future topics, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and of course, if you want to support the channel, you can buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/TCNS. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you like our video, hit that subscribe button down below, hit the bell notification button to be notified of future videos, and we will see you in our next video.